outside. It was a gray, cold, rainy November morning.
And sometimes it feels like it's been raining since the mid-'80s. Doesn't it? What's the most important movie from your childhood? Not necessarily your favorite or what you think is the best movie from your childhood, or even the ones that you watched more times than you can even count. If that were the criteria, a lot of kids like us from the 80s would choose movies like ROTLA, TOD, TESB, ROTJ. Oh, Legend. Legend was the shit. Lord of the Rings. Give me Darkness. The OG Gump. And Ferris's Girl. Full disclosure, I'd probably have to include Predator, Aliens, Lethal Weapon. You know those good, wholesome kids flicks from the 80s? No. I'm talking about the ones you related to the most. The ones that strummed your imagination and made you cheer. Maybe frightened you a bit. Gently smacked you in the face with only a measured dose of reality. And most importantly, even if you weren't totally cognizant of it, celebrated all that it was to be a child. Sort of. I mean, that one, sort of. That one, I can't really. That movie, that movie's a whole other thing for me. The Goonies, The Dark Crystal, E.T., Labyrinth, The Secret of Nim. Okay, it's a question I didn't really have a definitive answer to until this very moment. If you're 30 or older and you haven't seen The NeverEnding Story, shame on you. And if you have seen it, you remember it. You at least remember parts, scenes.
Come on, Artex.
And the subsequent feelings conjured. It's a sweeping, magical adventure, complete with all the bells and whistles, for a timeless movie of the time. Heroes and villains, fantastical creatures, very memorable 80s music with synthwave tracks, and like any didactic children's entertainment, a heaping dose of tragedy and trauma. Side note, why did they do this to kids? Life isn't difficult enough after you're forced to exit the freeway of childhood? We have to shove anguish down their throats and knee them in the nuts with loss because why? So the transition to real life is easier? So they're prepared? F*** you. You're never ever prepared. So let's just let the kids revel. But then again, isn't it ironic that the songs and books and movies that cut the deepest are also the ones that linger in our minds and seem to be cherished the most? So we're a generation of Stockholmed victims? The Giving Tree, Mufasa's death, E.T. barely alive face down in a f***ing sewer? Oh, and Nicodemus? Dead. What the Sorry. Back on track. But while the film is the focus of this melodramatic retrospection, let's quickly give props to its source material and the strangely sparse merchandise that accompanied it. The NeverEnding Story was first, if not foremost, a novel published by Michael Ende in 1979, chronicling the escapism adventures of Bastian through the magical realm of whatever. It's an easy, engrossing, and beautiful story that, like the movie, depicts Bastian's thievery of the book called The NeverEnding Story, and then getting lost in the book's story which you are reading. A story about imagination and wonder being powerful and intrinsic needs of the human heart and soul that run wild in childhood by way of nature or necessity when faced with trauma, and the power of imagination slowly and methodically being ripped away and consumed by the ever-encroaching monotonous banality and repetitive pain of reality. In a book, with luck dragons and giant wolves and turtle mountains. In a book called The NeverEnding Story within a book of the same goddamn name, where characters in the book are whisked off into the book, and you're imagining maybe you're relating to those characters in the books. That is some Inception level shit, and in 1979 no less. Actually, that's not the worst idea, just to make sure. Remind me to check back on this in a little bit. Fast forward to 1984, and the Gen Xers around the world were treated to, and in a lot of cases, imprinted forever by Wolfgang Petersen's film based on the first half of the novel. I refuse to get caught up in the whole bullshit novel versus movie debate, especially in this case, because the movie feels elegantly complete without attempting to encompass everything that a book has the space and time to explore. Of course, it shouldn't end at the actual end, should it? It should not have an end. Hello! Like a lot of us at that age, Bastian is a boy feeling alone and isolated with his imagination, and the fantasies it conjures a coveted refuge, and sadly a refuge he needs more desperately than ever, as he's recently lost his mother. But alas, how Bastian copes is dismissed by his father as not coping, but retreating from reality.
You're old enough to get your head down out of the clouds.
Not facing what must be faced. You know, the adulting method of living that of course leads to so much happiness and satisfaction. So a child in mourning who is not accepted by his one surviving parent, who's also bullied, exerts a lot of energy to escape, and does so into a dank, dusty bookshop, guarded by a prickly purveyor. Aha! But a crotchety man with whom Bastian finds common ground. An adult who reveres the sanctuary of books, and heralds literature as the last bastion of imagination. The last bastion? Bastion? Bastion, 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 bastion. Ooh! Our grumpy bookseller solicits the book, baiting Bastian, and then conveniently walking off screen to take a phone call. And thus, Bastian's retreat continues and only ceases when he lands in the creepiest of school attics, which is obviously not a school attic. Have you seen it? It's here that he feels safe and at ease enough to venture into the pages of the book, and with it, blanket himself in the freedom to detach from reality and sink into another. Ah, but this isn't a review of the movie. As self-indulgent as it is, this is much more about why this film has stuck with me throughout my entire life, why I feel it's intrinsically tied to, and may help explain the mechanisms of my merry but masochistic relationship with nostalgia. How a movie from the 80s played a major part in psychologically and emotionally molding me. And it's not because of an inundation of merchandise. Sequels, not ones worth mentioning. Or persisting mainstream cultural relevance like Star Wars. And speaking of a lack of merchandise, if we had gotten anything back then, I'd be surrounded by it down here right now. Because I'm a sucker for licensed merchandise. For example, War Games for the ColecoVision, based on one of my favorite movies as a kid. Does the game work? I don't know. I have a ColecoVision, but it works about 10% of the time. But what we did get, as far as the NeverEnding Story is concerned, is this. A video game for the Spectrum computer. One of those cassette games. And do I have a Spectrum computer? No, I don't. These. And I'm not sure these were even licensed products. These figures fall into the shady category of knockoffs I own. And these. Items made seemingly by people like me, for whom the NeverEnding Story was paramount to our childhoods, and still can't shake it, won't shake it, and want to fill the void that was unjustly left by a total lack of merchandising. So why is it exactly that this film elevates itself to the top of my list for films that define youth with smiles and chills and everything in between? Because the NeverEnding Story is like a bittersweet guidance counselor. Okay, let me attempt to break it down. Let's get the surface stats out of the way first, shall we? Firstly, it's a solid fantasy adventure. From the perspective of a school-aged kid in the 80s, a very relatable boy outside the margins of what the world expects. Bullied, misunderstood, then escapes to a magical realm in which he's at first a spectator to a quest, but then realizes it's one to which he's assigned. 2. Awesome 80s tropes and music, orchestrated and synthesized to a degree rarely matched since that decade. 3. Memorable creatures, practically brought to beautiful life. Rockbiter, the guys who are just faces. Nightmare Fuel silver medalist Gmork, only second to Meg Mucklebones, because...
Who needs this tender morsel?
I don't even want to think about her. Falcor, voiced by Man-at-Arms.
That should do it.
With some good old green screen thrown in, and it's the 80s. That's as good as it's gonna get, all right? But of course, that's the shallow end of things. Now let's plunge a bit deeper. Curiosity, fantasy, imagination, a sense of wonder, exploration, and hope. These are the pillars that hold up the temple of childhood. And these are exactly what crack and buckle and, for most of us, collapse under the weight of whatever adulthood is supposed to mean. And at a tragically young age, Bastian is already feeling that weight. Fantasia is where he retreats in order to feel safe, to preserve the child. But even in Fantasia, there are threats. Banality, anxiety, monotony, loss, sadness, and nothingness. To me, the swamp of sadness is a kind of corridor towards everything that awaits to conquer you, i.e. the passageway to growing up. Atreyu, the bold, brave, determined, willful force of youth, moves through the mud with conviction. Artax may be the emerging adult who's already tasted what's to come and has already begun to succumb to hopelessness and despair. A symbolic white flag, not waving, but sinking into surrender. And yet the child trudges on. Fantasia is wrought with disguised minions of lost childhood, or at least a loosening grip on childhood, to warn us. Characters representing somnolent apathy.
Actually, we don't care.
Those broken because they couldn't hold on. Those who have lost and can't move on.
They look like good, strong hands.
Those who have completely given in to bitterness and are ruled by cynicism and rage. And yet, the child trudges on. Finally, faced with the vacuous void that represents what awaits those who surrender the creative, the hopeful, the wonder, the exploration, the imagination, the playfulness. Nothing. And yet the child trudges on. At times, I've been the rock-biter. I've been Gamork. I've even been Artax. But in the face of everything, those very attributes of the child are what embolden and empower Atreyu or Bastian. Maybe the child isn't the absence of strength. Quite the opposite. Maybe sustaining those virtues of childhood is what makes the strongest of adults. At least the happiest. Well, at least that's what I'm going with to justify all of this, okay? Maybe this is my way of keeping the child alive. This basement, this collection, this video itself, I admit it. This is all self-serving and cathartic. This is where and how the f***ing child and childhood survives. You grow old because you stop playing. You don't stop playing because you grow old. We have it twisted. It's not the way it is. It's not the way it should be. You understand what I'm saying? It's
Who exactly is he talking to?
You keep playing.
I mean, this is a bit embarrassing, is it not?
You grow old because you stop
I
playing.
really couldn't say for sure. Holy sh**, a talking toy! Wait a minute.
I will also admit that absolute resolution isn't exactly something I found, all right? Grappling with the passage of time and the ever-growing distance between the middle-aged man that I am and the memories that fuel my addiction to nostalgia feels like a war that'll probably be waging for the rest of my life. However, if you can't fully relate to all the shit I just spewed, know this: the story does not end. It is never ending. Maybe your role has changed. You aren't Atreyu anymore. Okay. Maybe you're this guy. But the story still does need you. The next Bastion doesn't find his way without you. So you're not Bastion anymore. At least you're still part of the story. And if you play your cards right, you get a front row seat to the next chapter. To witness and guide it as it continues. So how about you just be happy with that, you selfish asshole?
Despite now being middle-aged, he did go on to have many other adventures. But that's another story.
Turn around, look at what
see in her face the mirror of your dream.
And who has already begun to succumb. That's what I wrote? That's stupid. Look how ridiculous I look.
I like children.